rejected horse at auction is bought by a young man, and what happens next moves everyone. Before we dive in, don't forget to like and follow for more powerful stories that will stay with you. Now, let's begin. The grand auction hall hummed with murmurs, laced with boredom and indifference, as the spotlight settled on a motionless horse sprawled in the center of the ring. The chestnut stallion's coat bore a map of scars, silent testaments to hardship and neglect. The auctioneer's voice rang out, laced with forced enthusiasm. "Who will start the bidding? Do I hear an offer?" But the crowd remained unmoved. Laughter rippled through the air, mingling with dismissive whispers. "That thing's not worth a nickel," someone scoffed. The murmurs swelled, carrying undertones of mockery. "Looks like it's already given up on life," a woman in a sleek designer dress remarked, her voice dipped in disdain. Others nodded, their verdict swift and final. The stallion's dull eyes reflected nothing but years of suffering, its spirit worn thin by cruelty. In that gleaming, opulent hall, it was painfully clear. This horse didn't belong. It was a relic of failure, an object of scorn, not even worthy of a second glance. Then, something unexpected shattered the rhythm of ridicule. From the back of the room, the sharp scrape of a chair against polished floors sliced through the air. A young man, plainly dressed, out of place among the refined crowd, rose to his feet. His voice was steady, though unremarkable in volume. "I'll take him," he said, his words cutting through the space like a blade. Heads turned, expressions caught between amusement and disbelief. "Him? You've got to be joking," a man sneered. But the young man remained unfazed, his gaze locked onto the broken animal in the ring. Something in his expression, calm, unwavering, stripped the room of its laughter. A tense silence settled as he stepped forward. With the transaction complete, he approached the fallen stallion, crouching beside it, his movements slow, deliberate. The horse flinched, but didn't retreat. He leaned in, whispering something so softly that no one else could hear. Then, to the astonishment of all, the horse's ears twitched, and for the first time that night, it lifted its head. The crowd exchanged startled glances. "What the hell does he think he's doing?" someone muttered. But in the days that followed, whispers of the forgotten stallion spread like wildfire. The transformation was undeniable. The horse, once dismissed as worthless, began to reveal strength, intelligence, and an almost unshakable will. Its steps grew steady, its eyes bright with something long thought lost. Those who had laughed at the auction now found themselves wondering if they had been blind to something extraordinary. But what had the young man done to bring about such a change? And why did the bond between them feel so unbreakable, as if fate had deliberately entwined their paths? The answers, as it turned out, were more astonishing than anyone could have foreseen. Morning sunlight draped the small, modest stable in gold as the young man, Jake, stood in silence, watching the horse. He had named him Blaze, a tribute to the legendary bird that rose from its own ashes, just as he believed this stallion could rise from its past. Blaze stood stiffly in the corner, muscles taut, movements wary. His scars, both seen and unseen, had built a fortress around his trust. Jake knew he was facing an uphill battle, but deep in his gut, he also knew one thing for certain. This horse was worth it. So, he waited. Day after day, he sat outside Blaze's stall, speaking softly or sometimes not at all, content simply to share the same space. He never forced interaction, never demanded trust. He understood that some wounds couldn't be rushed to heal. Then, one quiet afternoon, as Jake leaned against the worn wooden panels, Blaze did something that made his breath catch. He took a single, hesitant step forward. The rhythmic sound of hooves against the straw made Jake glance over his shoulder, his pulse quickening at the sight before him. Blaze's ears flicked, his body tense, but this time his expression held curiosity rather than fear. It was progress, hard-earned, fragile, but real. Yet, breakthroughs never came without struggle. The next morning, Jake decided it was time to take Blaze beyond the familiar walls of the stable and into the open pasture. The moment the bridle grazed the stallion's head, he reared up, releasing a terrified whinny that split through the quiet morning air. Jake instinctively released his grip, his fingers trembling, but he didn't shout or reprimand. Instead, he took a careful step back, allowing Blaze the space he needed, his voice low and steady with reassurance. The scars Blaze carried were not just etched into his body, but woven into his very being, wounds left behind by cruelty and broken trust. The days stretched into weeks, each one a cycle of effort, failure, and the smallest glimpses of progress. Jake learned to read Blaze's past through his reactions, the way he flinched at sudden gestures, how he froze at the sharp edge of a raised voice. Someone had hurt him, left him with ghosts that whispered fear into his bones. The thought churned a quiet rage within Jake, but he knew anger had no place here. That wasn't a burden for Blaze to bear. So, he made himself a promise. For every moment of fear the horse had suffered, he would offer one of kindness. One evening, beneath a sky streaked in deep golds and purples, Jake decided to try something different. He approached with a brush, careful and deliberate, letting Blaze see his every move. The stallion tensed at first, his muscles coiled tight, but Jake's strokes remained slow, unwavering in their rhythm. Then, something shifted. Blaze's stance eased, his head lowering just slightly, and a quiet breath escaped his nostrils. For the first time, he accepted the touch of human hands without fear. A small triumph, yet to Jake, it was nothing short of extraordinary. What he didn't realize was that others had started to take notice. The same townsfolk who had laughed at him at the auction were beginning to murmur. Some watched with curiosity, others with doubt, but all were waiting to see how far this unlikely bond could go. Standing beside Blaze, in the fading twilight, the brush gliding over the stallion's sleek coat, Jake felt the flicker of something he hadn't dared to believe in before: hope. But deep in his gut, he knew this was only the start. Something was coming, something bigger than either of them could yet comprehend. The days folded into one another as Jake and Blaze settled into their unspoken rhythm. Each morning before dawn, Jake made his way to the stable, the gravel crunching beneath his boots. Blaze had begun to greet him with a soft nicker, though the guarded wariness in his eyes hadn't entirely disappeared. Still, it was a step forward, and for Jake, that was enough. He had learned to measure success in glances of trust, in inches gained rather than miles. One golden afternoon, he decided it was time to push the boundary further. He led Blaze to the open pasture, the fields rolling wide beneath the sun's warm embrace. Blaze hesitated at the edge, his hooves rooted in the dirt, uncertainty flickering through his dark eyes. Jake didn't pull, didn't coax. He simply stood beside him, waiting. At last, with a tentative shift of weight, Blaze took a step. Jake felt his chest tighten at the sight. It was more than just movement. It was a reclaiming of something lost. But before the moment could settle, a sharp, sudden crack tore through the air. Blaze bolted without warning, his eyes wild with fear. Jake's stomach clenched as he tore after him, calling the horse's name. Blaze's hooves pounded against the earth, his movements frantic, as though he were fleeing from unseen terrors. Something in his past had come roaring back, gripping him in panic. Jake pushed himself harder, his pulse racing, until he finally caught up near the edge of the pasture. His breath came in ragged gasps. "It's okay," he murmured, his voice low and steady despite his own racing heart. "You're safe now." As the sun dipped below the horizon, Jake sat outside the stable, exhaustion weighing on his shoulders. An older man approached, his gait slow but purposeful. It was Mr. Walker, a retired rancher who had watched Jake struggle in silence. "You've got a good heart, son," he said, his voice rough with age. "But you can't mend something broken if you don't understand where the fractures began." Jake lifted his gaze, confusion flickering in his eyes. Mr. Walker continued, "That horse has been through things, suffered things, that you wouldn't want to imagine. If you truly want to help him, you need to find out where he came from." The words echoed in Jake's mind long after Mr. Walker walked away. That night, sleep evaded him. His thoughts swirled with questions. What had Blaze endured? Who had hurt him? And why had no one cared enough to stop it? A decision formed in Jake's mind. He couldn't let Blaze's past remain a mystery. The horse deserved more than a second chance. He deserved the truth. As the first rays of morning light stretched across the horizon, Jake stood at the stable door, watching Blaze with newfound determination. The stallion met his gaze, his eyes calmer, as if sensing Jake's resolve. The road ahead would be difficult, but Jake was ready. He had no idea that the answers he sought would shake not only his understanding of the horse, but also his own beliefs about trust, forgiveness, and redemption. His search began at the auction house where he had first seen Blaze. The manager, a stocky man with a gruff demeanor, barely lifted his eyes from the paperwork when Jake stepped inside. "That horse," he muttered. "You're better off forgetting about him." Jake held his ground, his voice unwavering. "I need to know where he came from. I need to help him." The manager hesitated, then let out a heavy sigh and pulled out an old, dust-covered file. "This is all I've got. Don't expect much." The file was pitifully thin, containing only a sparse description of Blaze and a single name, Russell Tate. Jake's heart sank at the lack of details, but at least it was a lead. In the margins, someone had scribbled an address, a ranch on the outskirts of town. Clutching the file tightly, Jake thanked the manager and left. As he walked to his truck, a sense of unease crept over him. What kind of man had left Blaze in such a shattered state? The drive to Tate's ranch felt longer than it should have, stretched out by the weight of uncertainty. When Jake finally arrived, his worst fears took shape before his eyes. The property was a wreck. Fences sagged, weeds overtook the yard, and the barn doors hung askew, barely attached to their hinges. As he stepped closer, an older man emerged onto the porch. His face was worn from years of sun and hardship, his sharp eyes void of kindness. "What do you want?" Tate snapped, his voice edged with irritation. Jake swallowed hard, steadying himself, then spoke. At first, Tate was dismissive, brushing off Blaze as nothing more than a useless beast. He refused to discuss the matter, his tone laced with indifference. But Jake refused to back down. His persistence chipped away at the older man's defenses, and slowly, Tate's hardened exterior began to crumble. Eventually, he admitted the truth. Blaze had been one of many horses forced into relentless labor, pushed past their breaking points without a second thought for their suffering. He wasn't strong enough, Tate stated flatly, as if that somehow justified it. Jake's hands curled into fists, anger simmering beneath the surface, but he forced himself to stay composed. Before leaving, he turned back with one final question. "If you didn't want him, Why not put him down? Why send him to auction? Tate hesitated, his gaze wavering. I don't know, he muttered, voice low. Maybe I thought someone else might see something in him. I didn't. There was something almost shameful in the way he said it, though he refused to look Jake in the eye. Jake walked away from the ranch with more questions than answers. One thing, however, was painfully clear. Blaze had endured far more than Jake had imagined. The weight of the stallion's past settled heavily on his shoulders, but it only strengthened his resolve to make things right. That evening, back at the stable, Jake sat beside Blaze's stall, his fingers running gently through the horse's mane. I know where you came from, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. And I promise you'll never go through that again. Blaze shifted slightly, his dark eyes meeting Jake's. In that fleeting moment, something changed. A spark of trust flickered between them, a silent understanding, fragile yet undeniable. Their bond was growing, but deep down Jake knew this was just the beginning. The past had been unearthed, but its shadow still loomed over them. The truth of what Blaze had suffered clung to Jake's thoughts, the memory of Tate's cold detachment, replaying over and over in his mind like a cruel echo. He spent hours sitting by Blaze's stall, sharing in the quiet, offering nothing but his presence. You've been through hell, he murmured one night, his fingers trailing along the scars that marked Blaze's neck. But that's not who you are anymore. The stallion blinked slowly, his ears twitching as if he understood, and to Jake, that tiny gesture felt like hope. The next morning, Jake decided to test Blaze's progress once more. Leading him to the open pasture, he carried nothing but a halter and lead rope. No force, no pressure, just patience. At first, Blaze hesitated, his hooves locked in place as if the open space was too much to face. But Jake remained beside him, unwavering, waiting. Then finally Blaze took a step, then another, until at last they stood together in the middle of the field. It wasn't much, but to Jake, it meant everything. It was proof that they were moving forward. As their work continued, word of Blaze and Jake began to spread through town. People stopped by the stable, curious about the horse that had been discarded and the young man who refused to give up on him. Some came with encouragement, while others brought quiet skepticism, their doubtful glances hidden behind polite smiles. Among them was Emily, a local veterinarian who had heard about Blaze's condition. "You're doing something incredible," she told Jake, her voice warm with sincerity. "But patience alone won't be enough. His body has been through more than you realize." Her words hit their mark. She offered to examine Blaze and help create a recovery plan, and Jake, recognizing the depth of her knowledge, accepted without hesitation. He was grateful for her help, for her belief in Blaze, and for the chance to give the stallion the life he deserved. As Emily worked, she carefully traced the lingering tension in Blaze's muscles, the silent echoes of past hardships still etched into his frame. "He's got the spirit to fight," she observed, her voice thoughtful. "I can see it in his eyes." Jake gave a slow nod, a newfound determination stirring within him. Under Emily's guidance, he began weaving gentle exercises and careful stretches into Blaze's daily routine, each movement a step toward recovery. One evening, beneath the soft glow of the barn lights, Jake ran the brush over Blaze's sleek coat, his strokes slow and rhythmic. Then, for the first time, he noticed something different. The stallion leaned into the brush, his eyes half closed, his entire posture exuding an unfamiliar ease. A quiet sigh escaped him, a sound of contentment. Jake stilled, his grip tightening slightly around the brush, as a swell of emotion caught him off guard. In that moment, it was as if Blaze had shed some invisible weight, surrendering just a fraction of the pain he carried. It wasn't a full transformation, not yet, but it was something. A sign that trust was beginning to take root, that healing was not just a distant hope, but a real possibility. But just as Jake allowed himself to embrace that fragile sense of hope, a sudden knock echoed against the barn door, splintering the quiet. He turned, his gaze landing on a tall figure framed in the moonlight. The man stepped forward, the dry crunch of straw beneath his boots amplifying the tension that seeped into the air. "You must be Jake," the stranger said, his voice calm but deliberate. I've been looking for that horse." Jake's fingers tightened around the brush, his muscles coiling instinctively. "Who are you?" he asked, his tone guarded. The man took another step closer, his expression unreadable. "I'm someone who knows exactly what that horse is capable of." The air in the barn shifted, thickening with unease. The stranger's sharp gaze swept over Blaze before locking onto Jake with quiet intensity. "Name's Logan," he finally said, his voice measured yet carrying a weight of authority. "I used to work with Russell Tate. That stallion, he's not just any horse. He was trained for endurance competitions, built to push past limits most wouldn't dare test. But Tate?" Logan's jaw tightened slightly. He pushed him too far. Jake's pulse quickened. His gut told him there was more to the story, something just beneath the surface, waiting to be unearthed. "Why are you here?" he asked, his voice firm despite the unease curling in his chest. Logan's gaze flickered toward Blaze. "When I heard someone had taken him in, I had to see for myself," he admitted. "He's special, you know, more than Tate ever realized. But he's also been through hell." His tone darkened, edged with something close to regret. "Horses like him, they don't always come back from that." Jake instinctively moved closer to Blaze, his stance protective. "He's recovering now," he said sharply. "I don't need your doubts." Logan lifted his hands in a slow gesture of surrender. "Easy, kid. I'm not here to take him from you. I just figured you deserved to know the truth." As Logan spoke, the picture of Blaze's past came into focus. The stallion had been bred for brutal endurance races, conditioned through relentless, punishing training. Tate had seen his potential, but had ignored the warning signs, the strain in his body, the toll on his spirit. When he finally broke, Tate discarded him like he was nothing, Logan admitted, his voice quieter now. A flicker of guilt crossed his face. He didn't care about the damage he'd done, but I saw it. I saw what that horse could have been, with the right hands. Jake's jaw tightened. "Then why didn't you do anything?" Logan hesitated, the silence between them stretching long enough to hold more meaning than words could. When he finally spoke again, his voice carried the weight of past failures. "I wasn't strong enough to stand up to Tate. That's something I'll have to live with. But you," he exhaled, shaking his head slightly, "you've already done more for that horse than anyone else ever did." Jake didn't respond immediately. His mind raced, piecing together what he had always suspected. Blaze wasn't broken by nature. He had been broken by cruelty, by negligence, by a system that had only seen his potential as a tool rather than a living being. "So, why tell me this now?" he finally asked, his voice quieter but no less steady. Logan met his gaze, his expression sincere. "Because you're his second chance, and I want to help, if you'll let me." Jake wasn't sure if he could trust Logan. But one thing was certain. This man held knowledge about Blaze that could be the key to his recovery. After a brief silence, Jake gave a slow, reluctant nod. "All right," he said, his voice careful, measured. "But if you're going to help, we do this my way. Blaze comes first." Logan met his gaze and nodded. "That's the only way it should be." As Logan turned to leave, Jake's eyes drifted back to Blaze, who stood quietly, watching them. Their journey was far from over. In fact, with this unexpected turn, Jake knew they were stepping into unknown territory. Logan returned the next morning, a canvas bag slung over his shoulder, a quiet determination about him. Jake watched warily as the older man approached Blaze's stall, every movement deliberate, careful. "Horses like him need patience," Logan said as he pulled a bundle of rope and a lightweight saddle from his bag. "But they also need to be reminded of their own strength. We'll start with groundwork. No pressure, no stress. Just proving to him that he can trust himself again." Jake hesitated, but eventually nodded. He wasn't sure if he trusted Logan yet, but Blaze's recovery was his only concern. Out in the pasture, Logan demonstrated a series of exercises, his voice steady, his movements fluid. Blaze's responses were hesitant at first, every muscle taut, every step uncertain, but there was something in Logan's calm, practiced manner that seemed to reach the stallion. Jake watched, his breath held, as Blaze began to follow Logan's lead, his ears pricked forward, his steps losing some of their hesitation. "See that?" Logan glanced at Jake. He's starting to remember. It's not about control. It's about partnership. Jake took in every detail, determined to absorb as much as he could for Blaze's sake. The days that followed became a careful balance of trust-building and slow, steady progress. Jake took on more of the training himself, and with each passing day, his bond with Blaze deepened. The stallion moved with newfound confidence, his strides longer, his head held higher. For the first time, Jake caught glimpses of the horse Blaze was always meant to be. But progress came with challenges. There were still moments when fear took hold, when a sudden noise or an unfamiliar situation would send Blaze back into the shadows of his past. Every time Jake felt a sharp ache in his chest, but he refused to let it break them. One afternoon, as they worked in the field, Logan approached with a thoughtful expression. "There's something else you need to know," he said, his voice low. Blaze wasn't just bred for endurance. He was trained for high-stakes races. And if you really want him to recover, he needs to face the track again. Not to compete, just to prove to himself that he can. Jake's stomach twisted at the thought. The idea of bringing Blaze back to the very place that had nearly destroyed him felt wrong. "I don't know if he's ready," he admitted, his voice heavy with uncertainty. Logan placed a firm but gentle hand on Jake's shoulder. "You'll know when the time is right. But remember, this isn't about the past anymore. It's about showing him what he's capable of now." Jake turned his gaze back to Blaze, who stood beside them, steady, composed, his dark eyes reflecting a quiet resilience. The thought of returning to the racetrack felt like an impossible risk, but deep down, Jake knew Logan was right. Blaze's journey wasn't just about healing, it was about reclaiming what had been stolen from him, and Jake was determined to see him through it. For days, the thought of taking Blaze back to the track refused to leave Jake's mind. Doubt gnawed at him. Fear whispered that it was too soon. Blaze had come so far, but his past still clung to him like a shadow. Could returning to the place that had broken him truly be the key to setting him free? Jake spent long nights in the stable, sitting by Blaze's side, searching for answers in the horse's steady but guarded gaze. One evening, in the quiet stillness, he exhaled a shaky breath and whispered, "This is on your terms, not mine." The next day, Jake shared his concerns with Logan, who listened without interruption, then offered a solution. "Just outside of town, there's a private track," Logan had said. "No crowds, no distractions, just a quiet space where they could begin without pressure." It was exactly what Jake needed to hear. The idea of a controlled environment calmed his nerves, and after much thought, he agreed. They set a date to take Blaze to the track, giving the stallion time to adjust to the idea. In the days leading up to it, Jake made subtle changes to their routine, gradually exposing Blaze to new sights and sounds. Things that mimicked a racetrack without overwhelming him. When the day finally arrived, Jake felt the weight of anticipation settle deep in his chest. He led Blaze to the trailer, his hands steady despite the tension coiling inside him. The stallion hesitated, his muscles tight with uncertainty, but with gentle reassurance he stepped inside. The drive to the track was silent, the rhythmic hum of the engine filling the space between Jake's thoughts. Logan was already there when they arrived, leaning casually against the fence, his expression calm yet expectant. "Take it slow," he said as Jake unloaded Blaze. "This is his moment, not ours." Jake nodded, exhaling slowly as he took the lead rope in his hands. Blaze moved cautiously beside him, his ears flicking in every direction as he took in the unfamiliar setting. As they reached the edge of the track, he came to a stop, his body tensed, his gaze darting over the open space as if scanning for unseen danger. Jake stood close, his voice low and soothing. "You're safe," he murmured. "I'm right here." Blaze hesitated, his weight shifting uncertainly before he finally took a step forward. Then another. Jake stayed beside him, letting Blaze dictate the pace. The first lap was slow, careful, each step deliberate. But as they moved, the stallion's strides grew bolder, his posture stronger. By the third lap, he no longer looked like a horse plagued by ghosts of the past. His head was high, his movements fluid. Jake watched with a surge of pride and relief. Blaze wasn't just walking, he was reclaiming himself, one step at a time. As they completed the final lap, Jake reached out, his hand sliding along the stallion's neck. "You did it," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Blaze snorted, ears flicking forward as if to say, "We did it." But before Jake could fully savor the moment, Logan approached, his expression more serious than before. "This was just the first step," he said. "The real challenge is still ahead." The words lingered in Jake's mind. He knew exactly what Logan meant. Blaze had taken his first steps toward healing, but facing a real racetrack, one alive with noise, movement, and energy, was another battle entirely. The thought sent a ripple of unease through Jake, but there was no denying the progress Blaze had made. He was no longer the broken, defeated animal Jake had first seen at the auction. But this next step? It could either solidify their hard-earned progress or shatter it completely. Determined to prepare Blaze for what was coming, Jake and Logan spent the following days recreating the atmosphere of a crowded track as best they could. They played recordings of roaring crowds, introduced new equipment, and gradually exposed Blaze to the kind of chaos he would soon have to face. At first, Blaze reacted with unease, old fears creeping to the surface. But Jake never wavered. Every day, the stallion grew a little more accustomed to the unfamiliar, his trust in Jake anchoring him through the uncertainty. Still, doubt gnawed at Jake. Was he pushing too fast? Asking too much? When the day of the test arrived, the weight of it pressed down on Jake like a storm cloud. The real racetrack was nothing like the quiet, controlled space they had practiced in. The grandstands were empty, but the sheer vastness of it, the echo of unseen noises, the ghost of 1,000 races past, was enough to make Blaze stop in his tracks as they approached. Jake rested a steady hand on the stallion's neck, his touch familiar and reassuring. "It's just us," he murmured, his voice low and certain. "Like always." Drawing in a slow breath, he guided Blaze toward the starting gate. On the sidelines, Logan stood with his arms folded, his expression unreadable. As Jake and Blaze stepped onto the track, a staff member rang the starting bell. The sharp clang cut through the crisp morning air, making Blaze jolt. For a split second, Jake's chest tightened with fear. The stallion reared slightly, his muscles tense, his eyes flashing with panic. But Jake didn't waver. Keeping his grip firm yet gentle on the lead rope, he spoke with quiet certainty. "You're okay. I've got you." His voice, calm and steady, was an anchor. Slowly, Blaze's breath evened out, and his hooves found solid ground once more. Jake gave him space, letting him absorb the moment before asking for more. Time stretched in quiet patience until, finally, Blaze took a tentative step forward, then another. Jake walked beside him, keeping pace, offering silent reassurance. Step by step, the tension in Blaze's frame eased. By the time they reached the halfway mark, his movements had lost their hesitation. His ears flicked forward, not in fear, but in curiosity. When they completed a full lap, Jake stopped, allowing the stallion to stand still, to breathe, to take it all in. Blaze's chest rose and fell, his coat glistening in the golden light. But there was a new composure in his stance, a quiet confidence Jake had never seen before. As they left the track, Logan approached, a rare smile tugging at his lips. "You did it," he said simply. But Jake knew this wasn't an ending. It was the first step towards something far greater. In the weeks that followed Blaze's victory at the racetrack, word spread like wildfire. The once-forgotten horse, the one everyone had dismissed, was now a story whispered across town and beyond. People who had once laughed at Jake's determination now spoke of Blaze with admiration, calling him a symbol of resilience. But for Jake, it had never been about proving anyone wrong. It had always been about Blaze, about giving him the life he deserved, a life built on patience, trust, and a second chance. One crisp morning, as the autumn sun cast a soft glow over the stable, Jake stood by the fence, watching Blaze graze peacefully in the pasture. The sight filled him with something deeper than pride, something close to peace. Logan, now a steady presence in their journey, approached with a thoughtful look in his eyes. "You've done more than I ever thought possible," he admitted, resting his arms on the fence. "But I've got to ask, what's next for you two?" Jake turned, his gaze steady as it landed on the stallion. "It's not about what's next for me," he said after a moment. "It's about what Blaze wants. He's earned the right to choose his own path now." Logan nodded, a flicker of respect in his eyes. "Whatever that is, I know you'll make sure he's ready." Jake started to notice the changes in Blaze, subtle at first, then undeniable. The stallion carried himself differently, with a quiet confidence that had once seemed impossible. The fear that once clouded his gaze had faded, replaced with something resolute, something strong. It wasn't just his body that had healed. His spirit had too. One afternoon, Emily, the veterinarian, arrived for a routine checkup. Running a hand along Blaze's powerful neck, she shook her head in amazement. "He's incredible," she murmured. "You didn't just give him a second chance, Jake. You gave him his spirit back." Jake realized then that Blaze's journey had become more than just his own. It had turned into something bigger, something that resonated with people. Schools invited Jake to speak about resilience, about trust, about the quiet power of believing in something when no one else would. The local community began holding events in Blaze's honor, celebrating the stallion who had defied the odds. At one of these events, a young boy approached Jake, his small hands gripping the fence as he peered up in awe. "Is it true?" he asked, pointing toward Blaze. "Was he really broken?" Jake knelt down to meet the boy's wide-eyed gaze, a soft smile playing at his lips. "He wasn't broken," he said gently. "He just needed someone to believe in him." That evening, as the sun melted into the horizon, casting long golden shadows over the pasture, Jake stood beside Blaze. Their silhouettes stretched side by side, bound together by the weight of everything they had endured. What they had built wasn't just a story of recovery. It was a testament to the power of trust, to the resilience of the spirit. Jake let out a slow breath, his eyes tracing the horizon. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" Blaze let out a quiet snort, nudging Jake's shoulder as if in agreement. Together, they turned and walked toward the stable, side by side, ready for whatever lay ahead. Wow, what a journey, right? Blaze's story isn't real, but man, the lessons it carries, those are very real. This isn't just about a horse, it's about second chances, about resilience, about breaking free from the past that tried to define you. Jake saw something in Blaze that no one else did. He didn't see a broken animal. He saw potential. And isn't that what we all need sometimes? Someone to believe in us when we can't believe in ourselves. It's a reminder that healing takes time, that trust isn't built overnight, but with patience and kindness, even the deepest wounds can start to fade. And let's talk about Logan. How often do we meet people who carry regrets, who wish they had done things differently? His decision to step up and help Jake shows that it's never too late to do the right thing. We don't have to be trapped by our past mistakes. I think what gets me the most is the idea that strength isn't just about power, it's about endurance, about choosing to move forward even when it's hard. Blaze didn't just survive, he reclaimed his life. And in a way, so did Jake. So now, I want to hear from you. What was your favorite part of the story? Did it remind you of anything in your own life? Drop a comment below and let's talk about it. And hey, if you loved this journey, don't forget to like and subscribe. I've got more stories coming your way. See you in the next one.